we start with some introductory matters on Hebrews, which are interesting. First I want to talk about the genre of the book, and it's an epistle, right? Clearly it's an epistle, but it's different, isn't it? I mean, we don't start, we look at it here, Paul's epistles, most epistles in the New Testament start by identifying the author and naming the recipients. And we don't have that in this letter. Instead, it starts in a very exalted and beautiful and even scholarly way. You know, you've all read Greek. Hebrew's Greek is difficult, isn't it? And we know one thing reading this: the person who wrote this book, this letter, is very educated. So, you know, John, they're all intelligent, right? And God gifted and inspired all these writers, but John's Greek is very simple, the simplest in the New Testament. And Paul's is sort of in between, but this is some of the most difficult Greek. So maybe you haven't studied a book like this yet. It depends on where you are. So it's an epistle, but a little bit different of an epistle. And yet it has some epistolary features at the end of the book. So we'll just see. At the end of the book, we sort of see the kinds of things that we find in epistles, the last 3 verses. So we probably won't cover these again. Brothers and sisters. By the way, this translation is the Christian Standard Bible. I was the co-chair of this translation, so I'm biased, but I like this translation. I think brothers and sisters is a good translation, by the way, of adelphoi there in the Greek for our contemporary world. He says, I urge you to receive this message of exhortation, for I've written to you briefly. So, you know, you might not think this is so brief, but you can read Hebrews out loud in about an hour, and that would represent probably a sermon. It's an epistolary sermon. And here he says it's a message of exhortation. Since you do know Greek, it's in the Greek, it's logou tes parakleseos. So that's the exact phrase, right? You see it there, tu logou tes parakleseos, which is translated well here, a message or a word of exhortation. I just want you to see we have those exact words somewhere else. That's Acts 13:15. In this passage, Paul, and he's with Barnabas, they're traveling, and they come to Pisidian Antioch, which is in the middle of the country of Turkey today, right? It's the Sabbath. So, you have a Sabbath reading. They read the law and the prophets, and then they invite Paul, right? They say, Paul and Barnabas, but Paul's the one who speaks. Brothers, if you have any word of encouragement for the people, you can speak. And Paul proceeds to give a sermon, which we're not going to read here, but what I want you to notice is they say if you have a word of encouragement, and it's logos parakleseos, the exact same words we find in Hebrew. Do you have a sermon for us? Do you have a word of exhortation? So when we come back to Hebrews, we say, what Hebrews is, it's a letter, but it's sermonic. It's a logos parakleseos. It's a word of exhortation. We have a sermon here for the readers, and it's brief. People have different standards. Some people in the United States, sermons can be as short as 10 minutes, or over an hour. So it depends. My son was. My oldest son, it was in a church in Portland, Oregon, and I think the pastor there, maybe some of you even know his name, Michael Lawrence. I think Michael, maybe his longest sermon was 70 to 75 minutes. So sometimes Michael would preach a longer sermon, at least for our culture. So let me say something more about the sermon. So therefore, even though this author, we'll talk more about who the author is shortly, even though this author is very educated, he's writing for a pastoral purpose. So what's the implication for us? This is a pastoral letter. He's not just writing an abstract academic theology. He is trying to shape and form the lives of his readers. So that's what's going on here, right? It's a pragmatic letter at the end of the day. Very theological, very beautiful. And then we have some other epistolary features at the end that are typical at the end of letters, right? So he speaks of Timothy, who apparently has been in prison and has been released. So he says, look, I want you to know Timothy's been released from prison. Obviously, this author knows Timothy and is friends with Timothy. But he never named himself, right, the author. If he comes soon enough, he will be with you when I see you. So he's going to come, presumably, hopefully, with the author, and we'll talk more about where these people are. And then, as very common at the end of letters, we have a greeting, right? The greeting, greet all your leaders and all the saints. So, of course, you're very familiar with the fact that believers are called saints. We're holy ones, right? That's all believers. We're all holy ones by virtue of belonging to Jesus. But it's interesting that he mentions the leaders. We'll talk about this, Lord willing, again, it's at the end of the letter. But it's interesting, in this last chapter, the leaders come up 3 times, right? Remember your leaders, 13:7. And then in 13:17, he says, obey your leaders. And then at the end of the letter, we see greet your leaders. And the word he uses there, hegumenos, I think that's the word. Is that the word he uses every time? I think so. Yeah, hegumenos for leaders. And same word there in the participle. So, a very general term for leaders. He doesn't call them elders. They probably were elders. He doesn't call them pastors, right? He doesn't call them overseers. He just uses a general word for leaders. And he says to greet them. They play such a big role in the congregation. Greet the leaders and the saints. So here, we'll come back to this. Those who are from Italy send you greetings. So that's very interesting. We don't have a lot of details in this letter. Here's one detail that emerges. And then, very typical of New Testament letters, right? It ends with a grace prayer, a grace benediction. Grace be with all of you. So that's significant, isn't it? What these readers need, we'll see as we study, what these readers need is God's grace. Of course, we all need God's grace, don't we? But they're facing particular struggles in their life. And in a way, we could sum up this whole book as this letter is an impartation of grace to the readers. And he prays, grace be with you, I think generally, but also I think he has in mind what I've written in this letter is what will give you grace. God gives grace to his people fundamentally through his word, through his truth. So, but again, our main point here is just to say, yes, this is an epistle and a sermon together. Now we come to the second issue, one of the most controversial in the letter, and that's who wrote the letter. Who's the author? As we've already mentioned, he never names himself. So, in the Western church, the idea that Paul wrote the letter was resisted. By the Western church, I mean Rome, in the ancient world when this letter was written. I mean Rome and areas closer to Rome by the Western church. But we're especially talking about Rome. So the Western church did not think Paul wrote Hebrews. However, that Paul wrote the letter was accepted by Clement of Alexandria. So that's Egypt, right? You know where that is. You're very close to it here. So Clement, a very famous early church father, argued that very close to Origen in his theology and way of phrasing and explaining things. Clement argued that Paul wrote the letter. And Origen, we'll come back to this, but Origen suggested Paul wrote this letter. Of course, Origen writing, when did he die? I don't have the exact date, around 250, I think, AD. But Origen, one of the most famous church fathers, and of course you can read many things by Clement and Origen today, and perhaps you've read some of what they've written. A contemporary scholar who supports Pauline authorship, and there are books about this if you're interested, David Allen Black. So David Allen Black has taught for many years at a sister seminary. So I'm at Southern Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky, and David Allen Black has taught for many years at Southeastern Theological Seminary, which is in North Carolina. And I don't know if David's still teaching. We're about the same age, but there's a book on who wrote Hebrews, and he defends in this book, he defends what's a minority view today, but he defends the historic view, right, going back to Clement. He defends that historic view and kind of hinted at by Origen that Paul wrote this letter. Others say that Luke wrote up what Paul was thinking, right? That we have, and I'm going to come back to that again. And again, Origen suggests that as well. So what we have here is Luke wrote up Paul's work. And then in the early church, Pauline authorship triumphed through Jerome and Augustine. So Jerome and Augustine, just roughly we can say 400 AD. So, if Origen dies about 250, we're talking about a century and a half later. And both Jerome and Augustine argued that Paul wrote Hebrews. So that has been the majority view through church history because, as you know, Jerome and Augustine, two great scholars in the early church, exercised great influence. And those two amazing churchmen and scholars defending Pauline authorship had a tremendous influence on the church all throughout history. So now, from that point on until really modern times, until when I say modern times, I mean like starting in the 1800s, most people argued that Paul wrote the letter. However, as I mentioned, most scholars today, and that includes me, don't think Paul wrote Hebrews. So what are the arguments against Paul writing it? And the first one is the author never mentions his name. So, none of these arguments, as we think about something like this, none of these arguments are determinative, right? Because we're just using reasons to try to figure it out, because this can't be a matter of orthodoxy, can it? Because the text doesn't say who wrote it. So we're trying to piece together what's going on here. But in all 13 of Paul's letters, he names himself right from the beginning, sometimes several times in a letter. So it is striking that then there's no name on this letter. So that seems to point against Pauline authorship. Second, an argument from style. Arguments from style are very, very difficult. I actually don't have, does somebody have this is a very strange question. So let me borrow your Bible for a minute. Can I do that? So I don't actually, I was telling Josh, I read my Bible now because I use the Greek and Hebrew a lot, almost always from my computer. So, because I use accordance. So brothers and sisters, here's the Pauline letters. Look at that. Look how many pages. Look how few pages. Isn't that amazing? Sometimes we don't think of that because we study him very intensely and we think, Paul, he wrote so much, but look at that. It is so little. you know? So, what's my point? My point is, well, it's hard to make very decisive arguments from style when you have such a limited corpus, right? So few pages. You know, if we read C.S. Lewis, you read Tolkien, we read a modern author, you know, you read J.K. Rowling. I don't know if Harry Potter's popular here, but, you know, there's a lot, right? But so that's a very limited amount. So what's my point? Arguments from style, hard to make much of them. However, having said that, it is striking for all of us who've read Greek, and if you've had a chance to read it, it is striking how different the style is of Hebrews from all of Paul's letters. I don't want to make too much of that. You know, scholars try to make similar arguments for why Paul didn't write the pastorals, and I think Paul did write the pastorals, and all the letters assigned to his name. But having said that, this letter, I already mentioned this, is more polished in its Greek style and vocabulary. So that's the second argument. Not a knockdown argument, right? Not an argument that's absolutely decisive, but seems to tilt away from Pauline authorship. And then the third argument is, and I think this is actually the most important, the author seems to separate himself from the apostles. So let's look at that one. That is Hebrews chapter 2, verse 3. He says, how will we escape if we neglect such a great salvation? This salvation had its beginning when it was spoken of by the Lord, and it was confirmed to us by those who heard him. Now, again, clearly Paul wasn't part of the original 12. He could have written this. However, everywhere else, Paul emphasizes that he's equally an apostle with the 12 and independently an apostle of the 12. I mean, if we read Galatians, which is what I did with you last time, I know you weren't all here, but Paul emphasizes in Galatians that strictly speaking, he did not need the other 12 apostles because he got his gospel directly from Jesus. But this author presents himself as dependent on the original apostolic testimony. You notice that in the text? It was confirmed to us, including himself, by those who heard him. So that seems like a strange thing for Paul to say, given everything else he wrote. And I think that's convincing to say Paul isn't the author. Well, if Paul isn't the author, who is? And a very fascinating guess is that it's Apollos. So you know Apollos from Acts 18 and 19. And 1 Corinthians, he shows up especially in the first few chapters of 1 Corinthians. We know from Acts 18 and 19 that Apollos was a very eloquent speaker from Alexandria. This book seems to have some Alexandrian characteristics. Sort of, I'll return to that later. But Apollos is very educated, eloquent. This author is educated and eloquent. And Luther, the famous Martin Luther, suggested Apollos being the author. So I think that's a very attractive suggestion. It might be right. Today, that view is defended by a person who's done a lot of work in Hebrews named George Guthrie. I don't know if you know that name. George Guthrie. George wrote the NIVAC commentary on Hebrews, the New International Version Application Commentary. Maybe you have it in your library, do you? You do. And George also did his dissertation on the structure of Hebrews. So George has spent a lot of time in Hebrews, and he argues Apollos wrote it. Maybe that's true. What does it have against it? Against it is that no early church father or writer ever suggested Apollos. So that doesn't mean it's wrong, because we don't know for sure who wrote it, but it is curious that no one early on ever suggested Apollos. The first person to really advocate this was Luther. Another really interesting guess is Barnabas. Again, no real strong early church defense of that. But why is Barnabas interesting? Because, why, he's a Levite, right? We learned that Barnabas is a Levite, and this, as we know, this is a very priestly book, isn't it? So Barnabas is a very interesting suggestion as well. I don't know of any contemporary person advocating for Barnabas, but there probably is somebody out there arguing for that. Then another person that's been suggested, right? We already said some thought Luke wrote up Paul's work. Others are arguing that Luke wrote this in his own right. So that's another interesting suggestion. So David Allen Black thinks it's Paul. It's a little confusing, right? And David Allen thinks it's Luke. So, I wrote out their names just so you can see even the different spellings of these names. By the way, these names are in my commentary. This stuff is in a different form in my introduction somewhere. David Allen wrote his dissertation on this. His whole dissertation was defending that Luke wrote it. Then some people have actually suggested Priscilla. Priscilla and Aquila are sometimes called Prisca and Aquila. And then they say, well, she was trying to hide that she was a woman, because that would be, they wouldn't accept it. I have some ethical problems with that. But another interesting thing is, and here we do have to look at the Greek, he says, what more can I say in Hebrews 11:32? Time is too short for me. So there's the author, right? Me, to tell you, and then the me, and then you have a participle with the word tell, and that's what's very interesting, is that participle is masculine, right? So if it's Priscilla, she should use a feminine if you follow the Greek grammar, right? Because participles can be masculine, feminine, or neuter. So she should use the feminine. Of course, you can never win these arguments, because people who say it's by Priscilla say, well, she's hiding that she's a woman. Really? Okay. So very few people hold this view anyway. I just bring it up because it's out there. But Origen says, maybe it was Paul, maybe it was Luke. And then Origen says, who wrote this letter? He says, God only knows. That's my view. Who wrote this letter? I don't know. Maybe it's Apollos, maybe it's Luke, maybe it's Barnabas, maybe it's even Paul. I don't think so. But at the end of the day, I think Origen got it right. We're not sure who wrote this letter. Yet, just to say a word about the canonicity, I'm sure you study canonicity some. I recommend Michael Kruger's works on canonicity, who teaches it. He's the president and a professor at the Reformed Theological Seminary in Charlotte. This book was recognized to be canonical by the church. So that's the Protestant view, right? The Catholic view is the church decided what was canonical. But I think that view has many problems. We're not here to talk about this in detail. But no, the book is the Word of God from the beginning. It's ontologically, right? By its very being, the Word of God. And therefore, the church doesn't decide what is the Word of God. It recognizes the marks of inspiration in the book. So I don't think it's a problem that we don't know who the author is. So, that's very controversial. Do you want to say anything about authorship? Because I'm not going to talk about it again, so it's not too long here. Anybody want to ask a question? Yeah.
Do you think that the original audience knows the author?
Yes, I think the original audience definitely knew the author. Yeah, but and therefore he doesn't have to tell them. You know, we have a number of things like that in the New Testament, right? So, yeah. Anything else? Yeah, I think when we talk about canonicity, I don't think we say about canonicity that every book had to be written by an apostle, but we would say that they were books written by apostles and those closely associated with the apostles. So think of Luke. Luke was not an apostle. He wrote 28% of the New Testament, Luke and Acts. But he was not an apostle. He was closely associated with Paul. So clearly this person is closely associated with the apostles. James, of course, James is the half-brother of Jesus, but not an apostle. Jude, another half-brother of Jesus. So actually a number of the books of the New Testament were not written by apostles, but are still recognized to be canonical scripture. So I don't think that's the only test that they're written by an apostle. That's a great question. An even harder question is, where was this letter sent? We don't know. That, you know, the two biggest guesses, you know, actually I didn't spell this right, didn't I? To Rome. That's my view, that it's written to Rome. But the other possibility, it's written somewhere in Palestine or Israel. I had a Jewish student. He would always get after me when I say Palestine. He didn't like me to say that. He'd say, call it Israel. So, yeah, but I was in the habit of calling it Palestine. So every time I'd look at him and just a look of pain would come on his face. So you're like, oh, sorry. Yeah. But anyway, you know, somewhere in Israel. So that's certainly a possibility that, you know, this is a very Jewish book. So you can see a lot about the temple, right, and sacrifices, and the law, and so forth and so on, so that it would go to Israel. That's certainly possible. We don't know the answer to this. It's very uncertain. But I interpret, and it could go either way, right? Those who are from Italy send you greetings. I interpret that to say, along with many others, that the letter, that certain people who had left Italy, who'd left the church, right? It's as if they'd left Addis, and then they're writing back and they're saying, those from Addis who are no longer there, they're greeting you. Those who know you, right? Those you remember who've left. They're sending, or maybe people who've come to the pastor's college and they greet you. And so that's what I think is happening. So this is connected, that Pauline authorship was resisted in the Western church. So see, that's interesting to me. I think it's from Rome. I think the original readers, right, this letter is written, we don't know where the author was, but this is written to Rome, and the early Western church, who I think first received this book, knew it wasn't by Paul, right? So the other thing that's interesting is if this is written in Rome, and if it's written in the early 60s, the persecution from Nero shortly followed, right? So these people, presumably some of them were put to death shortly after this letter was written. I mean, that depends on the date, but if we look at Hebrews chapter 12, he says there, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. You have not yet been put to death, any of you, but that's coming. So we don't know. I don't want to make a big thing of this. It's hard to know. So when was it written? Again, you know, books today, at least typically, every once in a while, you know, when you write a book, you have to have bibliography. Almost every book has a date in it. But at least in my years of writing, every once in a while I come across a book usually an old book, there's no date. Like, what? When was this book written? But in the ancient world, they didn't put dates down, right? And I just found out, I guess I didn't find out last time, you guys have a different calendar, right? It's 2017 here. So, man, COVID's coming. I'm just kidding. So you could, it'd be very exciting. I'd be 7 years younger, so that'd be wonderful. But anyway, they didn't write dates in books, right? So we don't know, again, we're guessing when it is. But I already mentioned chapter 2, verse 3. It seems that the writer might be from the second generation. It was confirmed to us by those who heard. So that's one indication of the date. This letter is cited in 1 Clement. 1 Clement was written about 95, 96 AD. 1 Clement is one of the apostolic fathers. I don't know if you've read it. By the way, 1 Clement is in Scripture, but it's a really good book. And it'd be very edifying to read. You know, sometimes people are like, well, wait a minute, it's not the Bible. Well, do you read John Piper? He's not the Bible, right? But he can be edifying. So this book is an edifying, helpful book. But this author, it seems that he refers to Hebrews. So we know, if that's correct, Hebrews was written by 95 AD, right? And by the way, the other interesting thing is this Clement, this is not Clement of Alexandria, this Clement was from Rome. So that's also interesting, right? Another little piece that may connect this letter to Rome. Also, we find in 1323, Timothy's still alive, right? So Timothy, we know, was a young man, but whenever this is written, Timothy is still alive. Here's an interesting argument that's used. He uses the present tense. I'm talking about the author of Hebrews now. He uses the present tense of the ritual in the tabernacle. So some people say, so see, the temple still must be standing, because he uses the present tense. But there's two problems with that, though. First of all, he doesn't actually talk about the temple, but the tabernacle. And the tabernacle, right, went out of existence 1000 BC with David. So, secondly, 1 Clement uses the present tense of temple ritual. And when Clement was writing, the temple had been destroyed for 25 years. So that looks like an interesting argument, but when we think about it further, it's not very decisive at all. So I just mentioned that. It's not a great argument. So we're guessing, but thematically, I think he probably would have mentioned, given the subject of this letter, that the temple was destroyed. So I agree with those who date this letter in the early 60s, probably. It's quite tentative. Some people date it in the 80s, right? It doesn't change the inspiration of the book either way, right? So it's still inspired. Last kind of critical issue, what's the purpose? Maybe before I talk about the purpose, what's the situation? So we know these people are suffering. That their life is hard. So you think of the pastoral situation. I don't know what's going on in your life right now, but their life was difficult, and they had undergone some difficult things. So here's one window into their lives. Remember the earlier days when after you had been enlightened, you endured a hard struggle with sufferings. So they became Christians and they immediately suffered. What did that suffering look like? Well, they were publicly exposed to taunts and afflictions. So they were ridiculed, and he doesn't say what those afflictions are, but some kind of, we know they weren't being put to death, right? But some kind of discrimination. Well, we will find out something more specific. And sometimes you were friends with, allied with, those who were treated in such a way. Maybe they were passed over for a job, a good job, or whatever. Maybe they were fired from a job. We just don't know. But we know they were going through hard times. And then we learn, but some were even put in prison, right? Seems like it's a minority, because he doesn't emphasize, he doesn't say, oh, a lot of you are put in prison. Instead, what he emphasizes is you sympathized with prisoners. So that's significant. You know, in the ancient world, if you were in prison, the prison didn't supply your food. Others had to bring it for you. So if they didn't, you would die, right? So typically, most people who are put in prison have family, friends. So friends would supply your needs. And presumably that's what was happening here. And also, we know, at least for some of them, their possessions were taken. So imagine that. It's kind of hard for me to imagine that. I live in a very safe place. I can't imagine my things being taken. But they received that with joy. So they went through some hard times at the beginning, and they responded very well. But the sufferings, and we're not told, the sufferings are continuing, and they're getting worn down. And I think, now there's a big debate on this, I think these people are probably Jewish Christians. But some think they're Gentile Christians. And actually, that's becoming more popular today in scholarship, that they're Gentile Christians. But I still think that view is wrong. The majority view in history is that these are Jewish Christians because of all the emphasis on the Levitical cult and the sacrifices and going back to them. So I think they're Jewish Christians. Again, you know, like so many of these issues, it's not decisive, is it? Even if it is Gentile Christians, it really doesn't change the message dramatically. So we know they're suffering. We know they're going through hard times. So, right, how does that help us as readers? We don't come to this letter, if we put our minds and hearts in the shoes of the original readers, they didn't come to this letter saying, what a beautiful piece of theology. Wasn't that fascinating? You know, I mean, wow, that really stimulated our minds. And it was like a theology class, right? No, they came living lives that were hard and needing strength in their Christian walk. So it had a very practical sense for them. So that leads me to, why was this, what's the fundamental purpose? It's to forestall the apostasy of Jewish Christians, or if you don't think it's Jewish, to forestall the apostasy, we could just say, of the readers, right? So what is apostasy? Apostasy is falling away from Christ. So we could say the whole letter is saying, keep clinging to Christ. Don't, you know, I'm just putting it in different ways, right? Don't leave Jesus. And I think they were tempted to join the Jewish religion because the Jewish religion was legal in the Roman Empire. And by joining it, they would be safe from persecution. Now, of course, we know in 70 AD, the Jews experienced a lot of, their temple was destroyed and all that. But of course, that's because they rebelled against Roman rule, you know. Up to that point, there was an uneasy truce, and the Romans recognized the legality of the Jewish religion. So, for example, you know, in the ancient world, you had to work on Saturday. But the Jews were exempted because of their religion. The Romans said, okay. So the Jews had certain privileges. So the Christians were tempted, for the sake of ease, to compromise. So you know, so that's the issue. Here's the pastoral issue: compromise. Nobody today is tempted to compromise by going back to the Levitical cult. The particular situation we read about in this letter, is a temptation to no one. In fact, it cannot be a temptation because the temple doesn't even exist, right? Even if you wanted to go back to Levitical sacrifices, you could not, because they can only be offered in the temple, and the temple's not there. Instead of the Jewish temple being there, as you all know, I presume, that what is there is the Dome of the Rock, one of the most famous Muslim temples in the world. And, you know, there have been reports here and there of the Jews planning to knock down the Dome of the Rock and put up their own temple. But we can just say this: if that happened, it would be World War III. It would be crazy. And I'm not a prophet. I don't think the Jews will do it. So, but you never know, right? They may try it. But the minute they knock down the Dome of the Rock, there'd be war before they even started on any temple, right? So what we have to think of when we apply this text, if you preach it and teach it, right? You have to think of what does compromise look in your day like, right? Because that's not going to be the compromise we face, and we can apply the truths. So, right, but there's always that challenge in reading the Bible, the historical situation that we face, which is distinct from ours, and then how do we apply it to today's world? Well, here's the principle, and we can think of the compromises. And of course, I don't know your culture well. I know the temptations to compromise in our culture. So each community is different, isn't it? And of course, there are many commonalities, since the world is sort of a global village now as well. But there are compromises that we face. So that's one thing to think about. And I think as we read this and interpret this letter, and I think this is one reason some people don't preach and teach on Hebrews, is because they think, well, how do I apply this to today? So I think that's one thing we should think about some as we study it as well. Like, how do we appropriate this for today? That's what I wanted to say in terms of introduction. Is there anything you want to say now about the introduction to the letter? Because from now on, we're going to be in the letter. Yeah. Well, we'll talk about that as we go, but I would say I think it's very similar to Paul's in many ways, but I think there's one difference that's very striking, and that is Paul's typology, generally speaking, I think there are some exceptions, is linear, right? So you have an event in history, say, let's just pick the temple, right? And then the temple in the Old Testament is now typologically referring to the church, right? In Paul, you're now the temple, and there's a historical link, right? Hebrews does that, right? Old Testament sacrifices in history. Now Christ is the sacrifice. That's linear and temporal. But Hebrews also does this vertical thing, much more than Paul. It's spatial, the heavenly and the earthly. And we'll see that especially when he comes to talk about the sacrifices, right? And Christ's priesthood. So you have the earthly and the heavenly. So you have both a linear, temporal line, and then a spatial, the spatial typology, which, since you brought it up, that's a very interesting thing, because if you read, that reminds us of what? It reminds us some of Plato, right? And if you know Greek philosophy, you have this idea of the archetype, right? So the famous example that's always used, you have chairs, individual chairs, and then you have the archetype, or the form of the perfect chair, right? And Hebrews, that spatial typology seems to be somewhat like Plato, and then we say, why, there was a Jewish writer in Alexandria who imbibed some of Plato's philosophy, but it was still very faithfully Jewish. Who was that? Anybody know? There's a quiz question. Philo. So I don't know if you know the Jewish writer Philo. We have a lot of his works today. But if you read Philo is very much influenced by Plato. But Philo was from Alexandria. So a lot of people have written about this and said, the author of Hebrews seems very Philonic in some ways. And some have even argued that he's influenced by Platonic philosophy to some degree. I mean, that's a very technical study. We're not into that in this class. Most scholars today would argue, he's not strictly speaking a Platonist, right? But that's dissertations have been written on this and so forth and so on. So